All right. Welcome
Hello.
to the third edition of Between the Covers with Tracy Lawson. Today my guest is Linda Sittig, and this is we're going to talk about Linda's first novel today, but let me introduce her by saying that Linda was the sixth grade hula hoop champ at her school, and she is now spinning stories instead of hula hoops. So welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Tracy.
I'm so glad you could
Great.
be I'm so glad you could be here tonight. I wanted to talk about your book, your first novel, which is called Cut from Strong Cloth. And could you tell me, the background on your story is fascinating, and I've read it, but could you please talk about it for our audience?
I'd love to. So the way I'd heard stories about my great-grandfather, James Nolan, who was a textile merchant in Philadelphia during the Civil War. I was older now. I was, this was in like 1998. So I had kids of my own, my girls. I said to my husband, I want to go to Philadelphia and I want to go to James Nolan's grave and put some flowers on. So we get up to the cemetery, and the cemetery caretaker, a grave, it's a mausoleum. And I thought, oh, okay, the man did have money. So we went to the mausoleum, and there were all these crypts, and there was a crypt, and there was my great-grandmother's crypt, and I recognized a lot of family names, but there was one crypt that said Mrs. James Nolan. And I said, who's that? And he said, well, I don't know. He said, she's got to be family. That's the only way you could get into this mausoleum. So I called the Diocese of Philadelphia. I said, how can I find out? They didn't know. The cemetery people didn't know. And they finally gave me the name of an archivist. And so I wrote her a letter. Here's my great-grandfather. Here's the Catholic church he attended. Here's this person buried in the mausoleum, and we don't know who she is. And it took about 2 months back, and it said, Dear Linda, her name was Ellen Canavan, and she was your great-grandfather's first wife. Well, none of us, and that started this whole, wait a minute, she was the first wife, and when did she die? And when I started figuring out when she had died, I realized that she had helped him become very wealthy, not the second wife that I descend through. And that just launched me on literally 10 years of researching everything I got her. So
Awesome.
It was fascinating.
Oh, that's great. I had the same experience in my nonfiction book, the one you and I were talking about. It took me about 20 years to do the research, but we probably could have done it faster if we'd had the internet when we started, huh?
Yes, that's true. That is very true. We drove to a lot of archives and did what you can do online.
Absolutely. Okay, so you've got this strong female character, Ellen, in your family tree. She's an offshoot. You're not descended from her, but yet you've got this nice little beginnings of a story. So how did you go from there? You did all this research, and how did you shape Ellen?
Well, once I started doing the research over and over again was how women were really second-class citizens in America in the 1860s. My mother had talked about how important education was to me, and so I started thinking about, well, where would Ellen have gone to college if she could get money? And I found out that there weren't any colleges for women in the 80s. There was one in Ohio, there was one in Massachusetts, but unless you were training to become a doctor, there were no colleges in Philadelphia. And that's what started kicking the whole thing off about, well, if you're denied the opportunity of an education, then what would education? And most of the women worked in factories, or they were seamstresses. Some of them became teachers. But if you wanted to go into business, you were, and for Ellen, she was female, she was Irish, she was poor, she was young, all the strikes going against her. My great all of this wealth, and my mother's stories were that the wife had helped him, and I now knew the wife was Ellen. And so the more I studied her will and all the different things that I could find out about her and her family, I realized she was someone who had wanted to go into business, and the story just fell into place. James Nolan met her possibly at church, but her brother Patrick Canavan, was a wool merchant, a manufacturing merchant, so they very easily could have met through business, and that way James would have met Ellen, and the story just started, just trickling out. In the beginning, the funny thing is, I thought the story was going to be written from James Nolan's point of view. After maybe about 10 pages, I threw it all real story to tell, not James, and so I started over again with her, and it just flowed.
That's awesome. That's great. Let's see. What else did I have? Oh, yes. So we talked about how women were basically second-class citizens, and even if you were smart and even if you had skills, you were probably known as a credit to your husband. And you think that James Nolan probably took all the credit, nothing against your great-grandfather, but in that time period, he probably took all the credit for being a really great businessman. And, it's too bad, because what would freedom have meant to a woman in our country's history? You wonder what else would have been created or would have been possible if women had equal footing with men in that time period.
Absolutely. I even found that she couldn't get her own, even though she had money, she had actual cash. It had to be co-signed by a father or a brother or a husband. I wrote on, really feel her frustration of holding cash in her hand and the bank manager saying, "I'm sorry, you cannot open an account, without to be here with you." So there were just lots of things that today we don't realize the privileges that we have as American women. And I just, hard to cloth that the interesting thing is the cloth that they developed. Let me back up just a minute. Prior to the Civil War, all soldiers' uniform wool. Once Ellen and James put their blended wool on the market, and the government buys as much as they can make, and they become very well. Soldiers do that, become a blended cloth of part cotton and part wool. So she really changed military history, but unfortunately, 29, so James Nolan got all of the credit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also, she was an immigrant too, and I think that might have made it even worse for her, because we've got the immigrant issues that are going on right now, and people are saying, oh, we don't want people in this country. Well, the Irish were the immigrants in that time period that were the ones that people were trying to keep out, the ones that were looked down upon and not given credit for intelligence or being able to do things. And I wonder, it just makes you think, who are we keeping out or who are we keeping down if we don't open up and give people opportunities, because that's what America's supposed to be about. And I also, when I was reading your story, I thought, Ellen really had just barely more rights than somebody who was a slave at that time, because she was there in the antebellum period and leading into the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the Irish were really discriminated against. Now, Ellen and James lived in a set that was 100% Irish, but they were all immigrants, and basically the men, 90% of the men were common laborers. The women mostly were workers. To break out of that mold was, very, very difficult. And the Irish, within their own social strata, they had ice curtain Irish. That meant that you had made it in America and you had a lot of money. And then they had shanty Irish, which meant you hadn't made it in America. You were very, very poor. There's a part in the book where I use that, where Cecilia, Ellen's mother, says, is he shanty Irish? Because they didn't want their daughters marrying below their station. So kind of interesting how even back then there was that discrimination.
Sure. And that's, it's unfortunate because, like I said, you think about who, you come into this country and you band together for strength, and you cling to the people that are from your home country, and then eventually you do break out. Eventually you make your money or you make your way, and you're able to integrate into society. And again, at every step of the game, that's what America's been about. And, I was glad to see that Ellen was successful in your story and that she was a very sharp lady.
Yes.
And yep.
I felt really good to bring her back to life. The other thing was when she was buried with not her name, but his name, Mrs. James Nolan, I think by that time he was in business class of Philadelphia. And so for whatever reason, he buried her with his name instead of her name. But I felt that fair because she literally disappeared from history once she was only buried with his name for identification. So
right, that's like one more chance to be remembered. But yet he was probably looking at it like, well, she's a credit to me, or I'm a credit to her because I have a good name here in town. And so saying that she's Mrs. James Nolan, I mean, you have to believe it was done with affection and it was done with the best possible intentions. But just another, thing about society at the time that we wouldn't think about today. Because I think if you had young women read this story, they would go, "What the hey?" Because being raised by a mom who was a feminist-leaning mom in the 70s, that wouldn't have flown with anywhere in my strata. Yeah. That let the guy take all the credit for what you got.
Tracy,
Go ahead.
When I went to get my first credit card as a married woman, and it came to the house, instead of saying Linda Sittig, it did say Mrs. James Sittig. That my first credit card came with and that was in the applied to. I had a master's degree and I was applying to a doctorate program, and on the application, my husband had to agree to allow me to go on in for further education. And that was the 70s. So that's 100 years after Ellen, and things have not changed.
No, they didn't change that much. It's I'm thankful that at one point my husband said something about, I don't see how telling you no has ever made any difference whatsoever in what you decide to do. And that's the kind of gal I strove to be, and I actually even had one of my characters say that about another character in my first novel. It's like, have you ever tried to tell her no? It doesn't make any difference at all. And, that's the kind of gal you want to be. You don't want to have to ask permission. Yes. Oh my goodness gracious. But yeah, it's something that's very foreign to young women these days. And I think it would really be great when they read this to get the context and say, wow, women really were quite powerless. And and it's actually really cool that a woman revolutionized the textile industry in terms of the military. It's that it was her idea. So
yeah, and yet not get any credit for it. So
not to get any credit for it until now, because you've brought her back to life.
That is true. I have.
So part of your story takes place in the South. Did you also travel to the southern states to get the ambiance, or as you were writing?
We did. We actually went to Ireland first. I wanted to see where Ellen and would have come from, and they came from Northern Ireland. And in County Tyrone, which is one of the 6 counties in Northern Ireland, there is a wonderful old park. And when you go there, there's an actual ship, a replica of a famine ship. And so we were actually able to get on the ship and see how unbelievably crowded those famine ships were that brought the immigrants to the United States. And then once I started writing the story, I realized the same location. So we went and spent time in Savannah researching where Dr. Fallon's office would have been and where the and everything. And then because the Civil War broke out and they had to get back to Philly, we actually followed the railroad tracks in Alexandria, which was the end of the line. If you've watched any of the PBS special now called Mercy Street, that's
I haven't, but
road ends in Alexandria. So we went and actually went through every single piece of that journey, even to, I don't want to give where the unfortunate incident almost happens to her. We went there and stood where that would have happened, and everything was very authentic, which was great because then I felt like I had been on the journey with her.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. Thought I lost you for a second there, but you're still there. Yep. Okay, great. Let's see. So tell me also, I know you added some embellishments with the brother that may or may not have been true and everything. when we fictionalize, we sometimes have to do that kind of thing to add a story arc, right? And add the drama.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's actually a story about how that, a part of that. So after I had finished the book, I had given it to beta readers so that they script anything that was confusing. And at that point, it was James Nolan, and Joseph Canavan was Ellen's brother. And the beta reader said, it's too confusing with a James and a Joseph. You need to change one of them. And I thought, well, I'm not changing James Nolan, but I'll change middle Patrick. So I went on the computer and I did the find and replace, find every Joseph, replace it with Patrick. You know, it went, all 300. And about a week or two later, I was getting ready to send it out to an agent, and I was reading through this one section where Cecilia and Cecilia bangs her fist down on the kitchen table and says, Jesus, Mary and Patrick. And I thought, oh my God, it changed everything. And of course, as a Catholic, you would know, you would say Jesus, Mary, and Joseph.
Absolutely.
So I had to go back and go to every single one, churches that had been saying Joseph. It was kind of funny. He actually, in real life, did die the way the book ended, but he was a criminal aspect that comes through in the book. So I did change it to be more dramatic. And actually, my writing coach was the one who helped me with that. And he said that the coach's name is David Hazard from Ascent Writing Program. And he was the one that said, I think if we made the ending more dramatic, make the book stronger. And so that's how that happened.
Sure, I understand, because we were talking before the program started that I'd written a nonfiction book based on one of my ancestors as well. And when I got the journal, and I've got this 55 days of travel from, Cincinnati to New York City, and I thought, oh great, I'll turn it into a novel. I've got 4 characters, I've got them on the road. But then there was no conflict, there was no story arc, unless you want to talk about who got sick from eating tainted food what day, or when the horse got sick or what have you. Those were the big dramatic moments, and I thought, boy, there's really nothing here. I'd have to make up a whole story anyway. But the information that was so rich and was like all right there, I didn't have to invent anything, and it was so much stuff I didn't know about the context of the times and everything, that I think that like we said, with young girls not understanding why their husband would have to go and help them start a bank account, or their husband would take credit for their own achievements, just like we wouldn't understand the things that I was reading about in my ancestors' journal. And so writing historical books gives us context in the present. And that's really important.
And the historical details, I think, are what bring the story to life and make it so you a character arc with the character changing and conflict and things, tension going on throughout it to make it a really good story.
Yes, and you did a really good job with that.
Thank you.
I'm kind of picky about my historical fiction because I like history so much. And when I read yours, I was like, yeah, I nailed it, because the times and how the people would have behaved and everything. I think you were spot on. So.
Oh, great. Thank you. One of the things that was interesting was researching the food. I knew all the Irish food because of my family. I really didn't know the food in Savannah. And so I actually wound up reading lots of old cookbooks from the 18 recipes for rabbits and everything else. But it was really interesting to read. Creme brulee was a very popular dessert in Savannah in the 1860s, and we think of that as a very trendy dessert today, but was actually being served down there at that point. So that was really interesting.
Oh yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing what we go through to get the details.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. I don't know if I would have thought to go to cookbooks. You did a really good job with that.
Well, I was doing part of a scene, and I was trying to figure out what would they be drinking at noon. I knew they had Madeira tea at breakfast, but I couldn't figure out what they would be drinking. You don't have iced tea or sweet tea back in the 1860s yet. So I wrote contemporary cookbook authors, Damon Fowler, great guy, wrote right back and said they drank cider, like apple cider is what they would have been drinking.
Okay.
I would have never those little details, though, that, you know, make it authentic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, in my book, early on, the family they're traveling through Ohio, and he records, the road today was railroady and very rough and hard on both man and beast. And I said to my husband, oh, can you imagine going over railroad crossings all day long in a wagon with no shock absorbers in a corset? Oh, the horror. You know, and I'm thinking about that. And then he says, Trey, there were no railroads in Ohio in 1838. And I was like, oh,
yeah,
right. And so then I had to go back and say, and this is back in the early days of my research, well, what do they mean by railroady? Turns out they meant a corduroy road with split logs in the roadbed to keep the mud down.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, that would be even worse because you'd be bouncing over these logs all day long in the wagon with no shock absorbers in the corset. And then, you know,
right.
just horrifying. But
right.
So, yeah.
Well, when I was doing one of the, when they were, and I could not figure out how many miles a day does a horse and wagon go if you have 3 human beings in the wagon. And
Mm-hmm.
but I fortunately live in Virginia, and they have a wonderful library of the horse. And so I went there, and I was able to look up all this information about, you know, how many miles a day. This was, and it's those little things that you can't just take for granted. So.
Oh, I know, because yeah, in my book, The Journey That Took My Ancestors 55 Days, my daughter and I did it, you know, in a week. And it was,
right.
And you just think, oh my gosh, that 55-day vacation with your family. And that's just on the way out. That's not even on the way back. And so no wonder there was no volume 2, right? So
right.
He must have said, heck,
Very
we got to drive, you know, just drive. But
yeah.
Yep. So did you take your children with you on the trip, you said, when you went to Philadelphia?
I didn't. No, it was just my husband.
Oh,
by that, let's see, they were in college. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, mine was 8 when I started that point. And so she was my navigator and my journal reader, and kept my photo log because we didn't have a digital camera at the time. So, but
right.
it was kind of cool to help her research in the dusty old courthouses and the archives and the libraries, and use a card catalog, because now, you know, most kids that are her age, she's 20 now, but most of the kids that are that age haven't really used those tools. And,
no.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about
one of the?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think one of the pivotal moments for me is my husband and I were in Free Library of Philadelphia, which is their huge library. And we were up on the 4th floor, I think, where the old maps are. And we found a map that I'm trying to see if there's any historical reference to my great-grandfather's factory that, and I know where the ward, and I know the street location, but that's all I know. So he went in the back, and he came out, and he had this huge old map, book, and he's got white gloves on, and he puts down the you know, which ward, and he starts opening up, and what was the man's name? And I said Nolan, Nolan, and all of a sudden he opened this double, and there was the entire schematic for the factory, down to every last detail. And I burst into.
Of course you did.
And he turned to my husband, and he said, oh my, he said, I've had people who go, wow, or golly. He said, I've never seen anyone start crying. It's years of research and now proving. So, and he actually was able to photostat it for us, so that we have the copy, which was wonderful, because then much information.
Oh, absolutely. I feel the same way about those township plat maps that show who lived where. And
yes.
I've used those in my book so much. And yeah, especially in the second book I'm writing now, that's about the community my family lived in, and when they returned from the trip, the business that they built there. So, you know, and who lived where, and, you know, the neighbor girl that he married, and you can see that her family's farm was right up the road and everything. And you just kind of go, oh, this is amazing to be able to see and know that if you traveled down this road, you'd get to Mary Jane's house, and Mary Jane's house is still
yes.
there. Yes. So it makes it so human. It makes it.
Oh, it does.
You know, they become real people when you see what they worked for and what they tried to do, and their achievements and everything. So yeah, that's fantastic. That is just fantastic. Yes. So yes, the book being Cut from Strong Cloth by Linda Harris Sittig, and I'm going to do my little promo for the shows that are coming up next, and then we'll talk for a couple more minutes. I put my glasses on so I can read this. Let's see. Next up is Scotch and Scholars, which is on Wednesday at 10:30 Eastern Time, so that's right after this show. Mike Reed interviews Troy Lanigan, President and CEO of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. His new book is Fighting for Taxpayers, Battles Fought and Battles Ahead. This book is a look back, but also a look ahead, says Lanigan. The aging population, the power of government employee unions, the missing priority of infrastructure, and the ideological war against economic development are all issues that will impact pocketbooks and prosperity going forward. Okay, that sounds like kind of scary stuff to me compared to what we've been talking about. And then also tomorrow there is The Future of Freedom, Volume 16, and that is at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're on the Liberty.me network, you can check out those programs later on this evening and tomorrow. So Linda, what else would you like to tell me about Cut from Strong Cloth in the few minutes that we have remaining?
Okay. My publisher, Freedom Forge, said, you better start thinking of book 2. And I said, oh, but Ellen dies when she's 29. And he said, you're going to, people are going to want to, are not going to want the book to end. And that's exactly what happened. I get emails all the time. So I actually have started, I've two, and it takes place with the next generation. And it follows them from Philadelphia to where they caught up in the coal mining strikes of 1894. So it's a completely different location, same family, but the whole coal mining wars of 1894, there was a lot of violence. The women got caught up in it. So it's a story fascinating, and the second generation carries on, and that'll be called Last Curtain Call.
Wonderful.
So hopefully out in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Well, that'll be great. And I'm looking forward to reading it because, you know, now that I'm hooked on your family, I need to find out what happens next. So. Very
great.
Good.
Love to hear that.
Oh, yeah. And it's fun to get to share and talk to different people, because the other 2 episodes I've talked to somebody about somebody who wrote a book about how the DEA stole Christmas, that the DEA had gotten through their heads that the Santa Claus Enterprise in the North Pole was really a drug ring. And then on this, and that was really fun. It was a political comedy. And then the second episode was about teenage superheroes in an alternate reality Pittsburgh, which was really kind of fun because that one opened up with the 17-year-old protagonist in confession, talking about how he'd beaten people up and he'd done this and he'd done that. And the priest says, how long since your last confession? And he said, 2 days, something like that. You know, it was some very short period of time. So I'm getting to meet such wonderful, fun authors here. And it's been just a delight to have you here this evening. And so everybody check out Cut from Strong Cloth by Linda Harris Sittig, and it's available on Amazon.com, published by Freedom Forge Press, our friend Eric Egger there. And
Eggers,
yes, a wonderful guy. We both have worked with him in the past, and he's he just had a baby.
He did. Harris, little girl.
Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. Yeah. All righty. But let's see. So I guess that's about it for this episode of Between the Covers with Tracy Lawson, and tune in next month. And thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.